Thank you all for coming. Thank you for connecting on YouTube. And welcome to what turns out to be the last of our Goggio lecture series, at least for the academic year. I am Luca Sumini, chair of the Department of Italian Studies, and Goggio chair in Italian Studies. And it is my pleasure today to welcome careful notes. My pleasure to welcome Roberto Binetti, who is currently a postdoctoral research fellow in our department. He earned his D.Phil in medieval and modern languages from the University of Oxford in 2022, with a thesis on representations of gender, history, and politics in Italian women's poetry. His research focuses on modern and contemporary poetry, as you will see in a moment, with an emphasis on the relationship between the lyric genre and cultural history. He has published extensively on various aspects of modern Italian literature, including Poetics of Becoming, on Italian women's poetry, forthcoming later this year, Contemporary Elegy in World Literature, edited together with Amelia Rosselli and Jonathan Kohler, also 2024, special issue Elegy Today, Resistance, Revision, Remapping, in the Journal of World Literature in 2003, and Conglomerates, Andrea Zanzotto's Poetic Clusters, also 2024. He's a co-founder of Italian Poetry Today and also Muse, two research platforms promoting the study of modern and contemporary Italian poetry. As I said, Roberto has been here in Toronto since this summer as one of our postdoctoral fellows, and it's a bit of a sort of a bittersweet moment to have to also say goodbye to him, because he's about to start a new position as research fellow in the Department of Languages and Literature at the University of Padua. So he will be leaving Toronto in just a couple of weeks. So please join me in welcoming Roberto to share with us his research, but also to wish him all the best in his new position.
Thank you very much, Luca, for the generous introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here presenting this research, which was made possible thanks to the postdoctoral fellowship of the Department of Italian Studies. And also thank you to my mentors, Professor Luca Sumini, and also Professor Luisa Moalla, who were of great support during this year to start this new book project. Great thank you also to the other members of the Department of the Italian Community here in Toronto, Carla Isenbite, Paolo Tasca, Angelica Pesarini, Laura Gallinella, Giulia Chiamari, and Vittorio Torkowski. It was a great pleasure to spend some time in Toronto and to start beginning this new project. So today I will be presenting a lecture based on my new book, which focuses on the relationship between the nuclear age and the representation of the so-called nuclear anxiety within Italian modern and contemporary poetry. As my students know already from my lectures, I like always to start with a visual prompt in order to explain, introduce some very complex and nuanced concepts, such as the relationship between an emotion and a literary genre, such as lyric poetry. So for today, I decided to open this lecture we've chosen options from very recent movies that came out this year in 2023, and that kept us busy discussing about also the overlappings between, on the one hand, Oppenheimer by Christopher Nolan, and on the other hand, Barbie by Greta Gerwig. Apparently, they are two movies completely disconnected from one another. One is, of course, dedicating and focusing on the representation of the scientists who invented, together with a series of other physicists from the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb, which was used for the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. And on the other hand, a completely different film, Barbie, focused on the sort of on the couple of Barbie and Ken trying to deconstruct a sort of patriarchal society based on this ideal representation of Barbie, which we know very well. What I find interesting comparing these two snapshots is the breaking of the third wall between the actor and the audience, the spectator in front of these images, and the communication of this emotional anxiety, dread, and threat towards something which is external to the subjects represented. I wanted also to open this lecture with another less known, probably, a movie by Michelangelo Antonioni, L'Eclisse, in which we find two protagonists, Vittoria and Piero, who were played by Alain Delon and Monica Vitti. And the movie came out in 1962 and represents basically these very complex love relationship, romantic relationship between Piero and Vittoria. Vittoria tries for the whole duration of the film to basically interrupt and to build a relationship with this man who is deemed distant, not available, and this becomes a source of anxiety in the communication between the two. The movie culminates, I'm sorry for the spoiler, with an appointment between these two characters, Vittoria and Piero, which will not be basically met neither by Vittoria and Piero. The title, L'Eclisse, resonates with this missed opportunity, this missed encounter. And we are suggested throughout the film by Antonioni that this encounter is not possible due to an hypothetical atomic doomsday, which is going to happen, but it's not represented. There are some visual hints within the film, such as these buildings in the backgrounds, who basically produce and anticipate this feeling of anxiety towards the end of the world. So again, another relationship between two individuals who are basically struggling to communicate their desire, but also their anxiety. My project specifically is not dedicated to movies, but focuses on the representation of nuclear anxiety within the poetry of 20 Italian poets, from the Nobel Prize winners Eugenio Montale and Salvatore Quasimodo until the present day, considering poets born between the 60s and the 80s, such as, for example, Guido Mazzoni, Elisa Donzelli, and Maria Borio, among others. Why focusing specifically on Italy to analyze this matter? Because Italy holds a very peculiar status within global history in the long 20th century. Because on the one hand, hosted and still hosts hundreds of American nuclear weapons on its soil, I come from a small city in the north part of Italy, Brescia, which houses nowadays hundreds apparently of nuclear weapons under its soil. Italy is also very interesting to analyze as a case study for investigating nuclear anxiety, because it was home of the most prominent Communist Party between the 50s and the 80s, the most prominent Communist Party in the Western world. The other elements regarding not directly the atomic weapons, which I'm going to analyze within this book, is Italy's relationship with nuclear and atomic facilities to produce energy. Italy being the last country in Europe to close it's the first country in Europe and the G8 to close its nuclear reactor in 1990. So again, there is this very problematic ambivalence between nuclear energy, the use of nuclear energy, which is completely absent in Italy, and on the other hand, the presence of these nuclear weapons within its soul. So today's lecture will be divided into three parts. I will start by addressing the question of and the representation of anxiety within modern classics. I will rely on three main definitions of anxiety by psychoanalysts and philosophers from the 19th and 20th century. I will focus specifically on the figure of the apostrophe in shaping this idea of anxiety, this emotion within the lyric genre, and then I will try to read some texts by Eugenio Montale, Amelia Rosselli, and Andrea Zanzotto, specifically focusing on nuclear anxiety. So, the first definition, modern definition of anxiety, is given by Kierkegaard in his treatise of published in 1844, giving this first modern definition of an emotion and its psychological and physical expression. Kierkegaard relied on this specific idea of anxiety being the sort of possibility of possibility. So he's focusing mainly on this temporal feature of anxiety. Kierkegaard said, anxiety is altogether different from fear and similar concepts that refer to something definite, whereas anxiety is freedoms of actuality as a possibility of possibility. And he goes on, anxiety may be compared with dizziness. Hero's eyes attempts to look down the yawning abyss, becomes dizzy. But what is the reason for this? There is this dizziness of possibility. It's something we cannot control, it's in the future, but it's still present and basically results in this series of psychological and physical reactions. One of the other very interesting definitions of anxiety is by Freud in the 20s. Freud basically in his late production gives a various definition of anxiety, starting from a definition which relies on the idea of unexpressed desire and libido, which is found to culminate in an expression of anxiety, but in his more mature phase in the 20s, he reaches the second definition of anxiety as signal anxiety. I'm anxious if I'm in front of the threat. There is something external that is producing this sense of anxiety. And specifically, Freud identifies the origin of the anxiety not in something temporal, external to the subject, but in something internal. to the subject. The ego is the actual seat of anxiety, it writes in his commentary and study of anxiety in 1920. The third and last definition is by another psychoanalyst, in this case Jacques Lacan, who in 1962 dedicated a whole seminar to anxiety. And he gives a completely different definition, no longer relying on the subjectivity and on the role of the subject in terms of this feeling, but in the role of the object. There is always in anxiety, according to Lacan, an object of desire. And he says in this seminar, to set our target, I shall say that the object A, which is not to be situated in anything analogous to the intentionality of noesis, which is not the intentionality of desire, is to be conceived as the cause of desire. So it's interesting also how Lacan, for example, connects desire with anxiety. To take up an earlier metaphor, the object lies behind desire. Lacan, drawing also on Kierkegaard, defines anxiety as the possibility, or better, the impossibility of desire. Anxiety, according to Lacan, is the lack of the lack. There is something that is missing within this equation. We have a subject who is not able to reach and to access his own desire. This is the scheme that exemplifies Lacan theory on anxiety and desire. And he uses in particular an example taken from Shakespeare, from the tragedy Hamlet, describing how Hamlet is not able to recognize his desire for Ophelia until Ophelia is dead. And he reaches out against Ophelia's brother Laertes in order to manifest and express his anxiety. So the possibility of anxiety and the expression of the connected desire is, according to Lacan, possible only when the object of desire is gone to a certain extent. To summarize these 3 points, it's interesting to see how all these 3 definitions by Kierkegaard, Freud, and Lacan play with this idea of anticipation, a response to a threat, but also the relation between a subject and an object. And it's interesting to notice also how desire is frequently present in this equation as described by these 3 philosophers and psychoanalysts. This is something, the element of relation, which is for sure central also in a specific literary genre, which we'll be analyzing today, which is lyric poetry. Lyric poetry is a literary genre characterized by one of the by a figure of speech specifically, which is the apostrophe. Usually in lyric poetry, we always have a subject, a speaking subject, and an object which is problematically, especially in the Italian lyric tradition, often silenced, absent, dead, not reachable, who is not engaging in a dialogue. And this is the reason why I think it is possible, and also I can describe the vital relationship that between the lyric genre and the expression of anxiety. In particular, it's interesting to look at Northrop Frye's definition of apostrophe in his Anatomy of Criticism. The lyric poet normally pretends to be talking to himself or to someone else, a spirit of nature, a muse, a personal friend, a lover, a god, a personified abstraction, or a natural object. The radical representation of the lyric is the hypothetical form of what in religion is called the idol relationship. The poet, so to speak, turns back to his listeners, though he may speak for them, and though they may repeat some of his words after him. This definition is then expanded in 2015 by another literary scholar, Jonathan Kaller, who in his theory of the lyric dedicates a whole section of the role of apostrophe in shaping not only the lyric genre, but the emotions connected to these specific literary genre. As Kaller says in Theory of the Lyric, the primary force of apostrophe is to constitute the addressee as another subject, with which the visionary poet can hope to develop the relationship, harmonious or antagonist. We have already, and we can identify some overlappings between the images that we saw at the very beginning of this lecture and this relationship between speaker, a fictional character, and a silenced object in lyric poetry. This is something which is not present only in, of course, in modern and contemporary poetry, but which has a long history and could be considered one of the basic characteristics of the Western lyric tradition. Just to give you an example, I selected a sonnet by Petrarch. The number 17 is Fragmenta. It's very interesting to look at the first quatrain, in which we find this opposition between Petrarch, the lyric subject, and the dispossessed object, Laura, who is not speaking, but is still functional in order to create this dynamic, this logic dynamic within the genre. Moreover, is also fundamental in order to express not only the desire of the poet, but his anxieties connected towards his absence. Piovono mie amare lagrime dal viso con un vento angoscioso di sospiri, quando in voi adiventi gli occhi giri, per cui sola dal mondo io son diviso. Not only the apostrophe to though, to in the very first quatrain, but also Petrarch theorizes and makes very clear this separation between subject and object, which is something that we find, of course, not only in Petrarch or Dante, but also in other major authors within the Western tradition. Shakespeare, Gongola, Ungaretti, Baudelaire, Mallarmé, etc., etc. To briefly summarize, the lyric subject is expressing the desire for something that is considered to be lacking in that expression, and in this expression of their desire is also manifesting a series of contrasting feelings, such as also that of anxiety in front of the lost object. I will now move into the core of my project, which is devoted to modern and contemporary Italian poetry, and also I will try to highlight how there is a possibility also to identify some texts produced on the second half of the 20th century, the substitution of the lost object, so in the case of Petrarch, Laura, in the case of Dante, Beatrice, with a different object. In this case, in nuclear poetry, the lost object is the atomic weapon or the atomic age and the dread behind these very pivotal historical period in Italy. I will try to highlight a series of examples taken first from Eugenio Montale, and in particular I will be analyzing some texts from La Bufera e altro, which was published in 1956, but was written basically in the aftermath of the Second World War. So all the texts of La Bufera written between 1946 and 1952, the last bits of La Bufera. La Bufera is dedicated entirely to the traumatic experience of the Second World War, and this traumatic experience is reread and reshaped through an absence, the absence of a lost object, also in this case, which is the beloved Clizia, which is a signal for the American scholar Irma Brandeis. This figure in the first collection published by Montale symbolizes the sort of angelic woman, trying also to basically reshape the Italian lyric tradition, in particular Dante. I found in the same period, Montale was also starting to work at the Corriere della Sera, and they found a very interesting document which was published on La Stampa in 2006. It is a recount of how Montale, apparently during these years in which he was working at the Corriere della Sera, he was obsessed with the atomic bomb. And it's very interesting to read the description of this sort of nightmare that kept Montale awake during this period. Usciva una o due volte dalla stanza, prosegue la lettera di Morialdi, a fare i suoi passettini, fumando, spuntava dalla porta della redazione e mi faceva cenno di raggiungerlo. Un genovese in esilio come lui. La passeggiata nel corridoio durava il tempo di una sigaretta. Era il tempo in cui si viveva nell'incombenza della bomba atomica. Una sera, con un lampo negli occhi, serio, senza minimo accenno ironico, disse: te la immagini una bomba atomica su Genova? Magari su Carignano. E poi, finalmente, soltanto rocce sterili e qualche capra selvaggia. It's very interesting to read this text in this record together with La Bufera, in which there are several hints that suggest this nuclear anxiety perceived by Montale between the mid-40s and the 50s. In particular, I wanted to analyze with you one of the last texts from La Bufera e Alto, which is entitled Piccolo Testamento. Very first, it was written, one of the last texts written by Montale and included in La Bufera, and written in 1953, which is also interesting. Questo che a notte baluggina nella calotta del mio pensiero, traccia merde per l'ascia di lumaca, o sveriglio di vetro calpestato, non è lume di chiesa d'officina che alimenti, chierico rosso nero. Solo quest'iride posso lasciarti, a testimonianza di una fede che fu combattuta, di una speranza che bruciò più lenta, di un duro cerco nel focolare. Conserva nella cipria e nello specchietto, quando spenta ogni lampada la sardana si farà infernale, e un ombroso lucifero scenderà sulla prova del Tanici, dell'Asso, della Senna, scuotendo rali di bitume semimozze della fatica, a dirti è l'ora. Non è un'eredità o un portafortuna che può reggere dal lutto dei monsoni, sul fil di ragno della memoria, ma una storia non dura che nella cenere, e persistenza è solo l'estinzione. Giusto era il segno, chi l'ha ravvisato non può fallire nel ritrovarti, ognuno riconosce i suoi. L'orgoglio non era fuga, l'umiltà non era ride, il tenue bagliore strofinato laggiù non era quello di un fiammifero. It's a very complex text, very evocative, with a high degree of symbolism, but there are two main elements that I found particularly interesting in order to analyze this nuclear anxiety. It's a text, of course, dedicated to Madame Dice, who is not named directly in this poem. And it's a text in which you can identify a direct apostrophe towards Clizia in the second sentence. Solo quest'iride posso lasciarti. L'iride, this image of the puzzle, the rainbow, is a symbol of Clizia. What is even more interesting is the second half of the poem, in which we can find a second apostrophe dedicated to Clizia with the use of the imperative, conserva nella cifra nello specchietto, but the representation of what we can identify as a symbolism for the atomic weapon. The idea and the representation of the atomic bomb as a sort of Lucifer, Lucifero. La Sardana si farà infernale, il numbroso Lucifero scenderà sulla prova del Tamici, dell'Hudson, della Senna, scuotendo l'ali di bitume semimozze dalla fatica, a dirti che loro. What is interesting also to analyze not only the presence, this representation of the atomic weapon as Lucifer, but also the temporality that this poem is expressing. There is an anxiety towards something that hadn't happened yet. There hadn't been an attack in the Western world. That contains the Hudson, the Seine, but there is this possibility, according to Montale. What is also interesting is this focus on the end of time, which is explained by Montale in the last part of the poem. There is this reference also, giusto era il segno, chi era avvisato non può fallire nei ritrovati, ognuno riconosce i suoi. This possibility of recognizing the sign of something that is coming to an end. And there is also the overlapping between the doomsday and the love relationship between the lyric subject and Clizia in this case. The other element which is characteristic of this poem is the idea of the fall, which is personified by not only the atomic weapon, but its representation as Lucifer, un ombroso Lucifero che scenderà su una prova del Tamici. And I found very, very stimulating to read this fall Lucifer together with one of the definition of anxiety was recently given by Sian Ngai in her book on affect theory entitled Ugly Feelings, in which she analyzes the spatiality also, and not only the temporality of anxiety. While intimately aligned with the concept of futurity and the temporal dynamics of the peril, and anticipation in particular, anxiety has a spatial dimension as well. This is something that we will find also in the other poems that I will be reading today. I will now move towards the second author, who is Andrea Zanzotto, one of the most famous and important poets in the Italian tradition of the 20th century, and in particular I will focus on a poem from his collection of Epilogue, which was published in 1962. The texts here collected are written between 1957 and 1960, with the only exception of the text that we will be reading today, which is Everly, which was written actually straight before the publication of the volume in 1962. The collection focuses on the eclogue as a discourse on literature and the meaning of poetry in contemporary society. And in particular, it's interesting to read the poem entitled Adderley, which is a poem dedicated to one of the pilots who led the operation in the Marathon project and released the bomb on the Hiroshima. Claude Adderley became very famous in the late 50s because it was published together with the help of a German philosopher, Günther Anders. This collection of letters written by Adderley from prison. He was basically after the Second World War. It was basically held in a psychiatric hospital because he felt this very huge discomfort regarding what he did and the role that he had within the bombing of Hiroshima in particular. And in 1959, this book containing all of Adderley's letter was published, also in Italy. And Zanzotto, in that period, decided to devote a series of articles on this book, and in the end decided also to include a poem on Claude Adderley in his collection of eclogue. Zanzotto, in this article published after the publication of Nove Eclogue in 1962, describes how this period was very traumatic in Italian history. Effettivamente il 1962 è stato un anno di violento shock psicologico, uno shock provocato dalla situazione internazionale che si è improvvisamente aggravata, coinvolgendo tutti, artisti, scrittori, politici e uomini della strada, visto che siamo tutti nella stessa barca. D'altra parte dobbiamo dire che questo shock ha anche i suoi valori positivi, poiché ci dimostra l'intimazione violenta che la situazione storica ha causato alla presenza di ordigni nucleari, e mi riferisco sia al libro di Jaspers sulla bomba atomica, sia alla corrispondenza tra Adderley, il pilota di Hiroshima, e il filosofo di Vienna Günther Anders, si poggia sulla ragione basta. Il 1962 ha provato una volta di più che non si può andare più in là dei ruggiti. The 1962 is very important also because came after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was another very traumatic experience also that affected the Italian context in this case. I will now read the poem by Zanzotto. Coi tuoi gromi infantili, la tua non volenza, coi tuoi pensieri pronti all'anancasma, primo ti sei trovato dove ci si fa spicchiolire dal coccido eurocipite. Superstite guardi l'umano, su pattern confuso. Anticipazione o paleontologia non terrestre. Tu, caso ormai da trattati non più terrestri, superstite, sempre. C'è sempre, ancora una scheggia di te. E ora dovresti fare da santo, da illuminato, ora dovresti lucere docere, indurre turbe verso orizzonti di nubi sublimizzanti, ignee verso fondali, segni di pellicole. Ma tu muori ogni giorno, per farti superstiti una morte scolice, morte zecca, dulces docelis, intanto muori, indicativo di paura, sei per questo un eroe. In this case, we find another series of apostrophe to Elio, but the whole dialogic structure of the poem is completely different from what we have seen in Montale. In this case, the poet is addressing himself as Claude Adderley, as the pilot guiding the bombing of Hiroshima. So we find this overlapping between this man, repented after committing such a crime, and the role of the poet in society, trying to communicate this sense of dread and anxiety, and to make it basically, and to turn it into poetry. The poet is then described, the subject addressed by the second person singular, as superstite, but also una scheggia as a fragment. And there is this idea also of the pedagogical function of poetry that Zanzotto is trying to analyze and to reconstruct within this poem, which is very interesting and very clear of the expressions of Newcomb side. I'll now move towards the end of my talk, and I will analyze our third poet today, who is Amelia Rosselli. And to speak of the life of Amelia Rosselli, it's always conventional to begin not with her publication, but also with her personal history, which is connected to a certain extent to the micro history of Italy during the Second World War. She was the daughter of Carlo Rosselli, who was the anti-fascist co-founder of the movement Giustizia e Libertà, who was killed in 1937 by Mussolini and Galeazzo Ciano under the order of Mussolini in 1937 in Paris. Amelia Rosselli, born in Paris in 1930, underwent this history of deterritorialization, very traumatic, from Paris. Then she had to fly to the US, then back to the UK, and only basically at the end of the 40s she reached Italy for the very first time. So she's indeed a very interesting case within Italian literature, also because she communicates this series of traumas of not only historical but also personal poetry. In particular, I will be reading two poems from her first published collection by Variazioni Belliche, War Variations, which was published in 1964, but collects a series of texts produced between 1958 and 1961.
Un problema con il tuo account Apple Music. Per risolvere...
That was not part of Amelia Rosselli. Okay. The first poems by Amelia Rosselli were published by Il Menavo, edited by Vittorini and Calvino in 1963, with introduction by Paolo Pasolini, which is very problematic. I quoted just one of the passages, but it's also very interesting because already within this introduction, Pasolini pinpoints some of the key characteristics of Amelia Rosselli, thematical, outset. In realtà questa lingua è dominata da qualcosa di meccanico, emulsione che prende forma per suo conto, imposseduta come si ha l'impressione che succeda per gli esperimenti di laboratorio più terribili, tumori, scoppi atomici, dominati solo scientificamente, ma non nei sintomi della terribilità, in quel loro accadere ormai oggettivo. So Pasolini is identifying these peculiar characteristics of the language that Amelia Rosselli shaped within Variazioni Belliche as a symptom of historical traumas, and he quotes various experiments among which also this idea of the atomic weapon. I wanted to reference also the relationship between Variazioni Belliche in particular, Rosselli's poetry at large, and Eugenio Montale's poetry. So, for example, there is a text included in the first section of Variazioni Belliche entitled Perché io non voli, perché tu non cala, which was written originally in the copy of La Bufera e Altro owned by Rosselli, so in the copy of the collection that we mentioned before by Eugenio Montale. And there is one of the most ancient reduction of this text in the back cover of La Bufera e Altro, which I find also very interesting to see also how Montale to a certain extent influenced because Rosselli's poetry, and also some of these, the treatment of some thematics transited also within Rosselli's poetry. In this particular poem, I'm not going to read it, but I found, which is very interesting, the thematic of leaf-taking, of the idea, which was also present in Coro Testamento by Eugenio Montale. But the other element, which is very interesting, apart from the use of the apostrophe, is this idea of the fall, la caduta, which was also central in the representation of Lucifer and the atomic weapon within the design of Montale. A text which is fully dedicated to the discussion of the atomic weapon is another text from the same section of Variazioni Belliche, Variazioni, written in 1959, sempre agonizzante il lì traspariva. Sempre agonizzante il lì traspariva attraverso i fratelli con il velo in mano, sempre lusingato e lusinghiero conduceva per mano fanciulla, con il coltello al cuore rimava, dentro la colonna degli abissi scombinava le preghiere, contro ogni suo barbaglio mi incitava la pioggia, retta combinavo preghiere assurde e tutto il mondo crollava. Senza della meditation non è possibile sollevarsi, contro della spia notturna non è chiaro perché cade la voce. This is the first instance in which we have a direct reference of the atomic weapon in particular, and in the last line of the poem by Rosselli. But it's interesting to see how Rosselli, in order to express and to build up this image of the atomic weapon, uses a series of apostrophe directed towards a second person pronoun. So to go back to this idea of a figure of speech apostrophe expressing anxiety within basically a rewriting of the lyric genre. We don't know anything about the addressee is a sort of unidentified person, an identified object, but Rosselli plays with this idea of the absence of characteristics and identity in the lost object in order to communicate this overlapping between the actual source of anxiety, which is, in this case, the atomic weapon, and it's made explicit in the last line. Okay, this was the last text. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. Thanks so much.
Okay, we have time for some questions or comments. One task of the show is to break the ice when needed. I want to ask you, because you gave a little bit of a timeline at the beginning with going from Hiroshima to the Ukraine, and I was wondering if the image related to weapons and the related semantic field, if you have seen its return, if there is a connection between these events and these and the moments that you identified, like spikes, or if that anxiety has, for instance, I'm thinking that perhaps during the Cold War, that anxiety might have been sort of baseline anxiety that was there, so that imagery might be more present, whereas now, in the past several years until that might have kind of gone underground and be coming back. I'm just wondering, I guess the question is, how does that sort of historical timeline relate to the presence of this these images in the poetry?
Thank you. Thank you for your question, Luca. Basically, in the 50s and the 60s, it was very present, not only the representation of Hiroshima, specifically, which culminated basically with the other historical part that we'll be analyzing, which is the representation of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1961. But that is a period in which we have a lot of texts dedicated to Hiroshima and Nagasaki in particular. Moving towards the end of the 70s, I would say, we had a sort of decrease regarding the attention towards the atomic bomb and the atomic bomb. And we tend to move towards another kind of anxiety, which is more related to not the armament, but the use of atomic energy, for example, stimulating then the representation of Chernobyl and other events. But there is still produced on the last collection that I will be analyzing, were published in 2023 actually, very recently, and they focus dramatically again, in some cases also on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So there is a tendency of going back to the origin of the traumatic events.
Thank you so much, Roberto, for the wonderful presentation. Referring back to the first portion of your presentation, I was thinking of sort of hierarchies of emotions, also the genderedness of emotions, paired with the relational piece that you were bringing up. Now, because this poetry is even more relational, maybe than we understand poetry to be more generally speaking, I don't know, I'm not an expert. But is there a gendered element in that relationality of the emotion that creates some sort of hierarchies? We know that historically women's emotions were more related to sort of cardinal feelings, whereas, with men's emotions being more cerebral or intellectual in some way. So is there like a gender approach or reader-response approach to your work that allows you to sort of see how these emotions are not only expressed but also read and received by the readership, by any interlocutor of the poetry?
Thank you, Paolo. That's a very interesting question. Of course, the quotes that I analyzed at the beginning from Freud, Kierkegaard, and Lacan are indeed very problematic regarding gender perspective, because psychoanalysis in Freudian terms is basically built around a male subject, which is a very problematic thing then to use it to adopt. In that case, I was trying to historicize some of the questions that were useful in order to analyze some key features of the lyric genre. Within the book, I would like also to engage a little bit more with affect theory, in particular the work of Sarah Ahmed and Sian Gai, I thought to at a certain point, at a certain stage of the lecture, which are more nuanced towards the question of gender and also the positionality and not the difference in the expression of emotions, but again, a different kind of fluidity of emotions. Thank you.
Color also?
Very nice presentation. It gave me lots of ideas about anxiety and how to deal with it. I was thinking about the last verse in Rosselli's poem, which is La bomba cada. Non è chiaro perché cada la bomba, which you translated as is not clear where the bomb falls. I would have translated it as should fall, using the subjunctive. That led me to think of whether there is this uniqueness of the bomb falling or it's contextualized within the context of war, rationality, reason. Is there a reason why there should be a bomb? And I'm wondering whether in the poetry, of course, there's the question of conflict, and the bomb is there because of a conflict. But I'm wondering whether in the poetry that you're looking at, the bomb exists as a unique entity on its own, or is contextualized. Why should it fall? As Rosselli would say in that last verse.
Thank you for the inspiring question. I would say that in Rosselli's case, in particular, the theory towards and also the representation of the atomic weapon is related to the possibility of reproducing these traumas of the Second World War that she had to undergo. So it's a theory also of the cyclic nature of history. So it happened once, it could happen twice, and also 3 times, etc. So that is element. In the other poets in particular, I would define the possibility of the atomic weapon as a possibility. Using Timothy Morton's definition, I would define the atomic weapon as a sort of hyper-object, as something which is not material. It's a global object that everybody knows, but it's not physically present. You can touch it. It's something that indeed has an impact on our, had an impact, especially in the 50s and 60s, in the everyday lives of these citizens, these poets in Italy, but as something distant, not reachable, as a possibility using Kierkegaard's definition. So in most cases, not in this specific case of Rosselli, I would define the possibility of the atomic weapon, which is the main fear of these poets.
Can I? Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Can I just follow up, because you mentioned Kierkegaard, and the definition that he gives of standing on the abyss and looking into the abyss and feeling anxiety reminded me in a very cynical sort of way that when I read Kierkegaard in first year university for a course on religion, the big thing about Kierkegaard was the leap of faith. That you believe, there's no rationality for believing, but it's a leap of faith that you believe in God. So I'm wondering whether in a Kierkegaardian way of looking at anxiety, you could connect it with belief in the divinity or faith in the divinity, so that the abyss ends up being, say, religion. It's there and you jump into it. And the anxiety is, have I made the right choice of jumping this leap of faith into religion? And so it's a little bit away from your presentation, but I thought I'd be curious about your thoughts on
You
that.
mentioned the word decision, which is basically one of the practical ways in which this possibility is expressed. So the values, for example, models of life that Kierkegaard explained in Entrella, so the religious life, the aesthetic way of life, and the synthesis between the two. This creates also in this that specific philosophical system an anxiety to a certain extent, but related to the decision and also the possibility of deciding whichever path you will take in front of an abyss to a certain extent. And this deals for sure also with the religious representation of God. It's interesting to see, for example, in some of the texts that I wasn't able to read by Rosselli, in particular, in which there is this overlapping between this image of a Christian God, to a certain extent, and the stimuli of this anxiety related also to war and to the traumatic events she underwent. So, for sure, it's a combination.
Thank you for this talk. I found very interesting the first part of your lecture, and I have a question about the relationship between Kierkegaard, Freud, and Lacan, and I found very interesting how you're pairing this paralyzing possibility, how you're defining lack as a paralyzing possibility paired with the concept of lacking. And my question is whether you have looked at, or are you interested in looking at what is the genealogy or origin of this definition of anxiety as lack? Meaning, what are the sources that these philosophers, thinkers may share? Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's something that I personally haven't looked at the moment. It's always a good thing to establish a genealogy, really specifically on complex ideas or definitions. So this is something I will for sure consider. These were, in my talk today, were instrumental in order to see and to problematize the definition of one of the features of the literary genre. So I played, to a certain extent, not philologically, with them in order to test some classic definitions of anxiety. Kierkegaard is, I think, one of the first definitions. You can go back to the Enlightenment, for example, consider Rousseau, Diderot, and other philosophers. You can consider Jung. There is a very substantial ideography on anxiety. Yes, I will try to.
Yeah, I was asking because the quotation that you were from Kierkegaard is coming from Aristotle, and so I thought that maybe you had looked into how, if there was an influence taken from Aristotle onto Kierkegaard that connected him with Freud or Lacan. Yeah.
For sure, yeah. Aristotle is also present, for example, in the 6th and 10th seminars by Lacan, in which basically he's trying to define first desire as the lack, and then he uses the definition to basically define anxiety. And he does so using 3 examples, which are Aristotle, metaphysics, then the troubadour poetry, and the third one is Hamlet, which I quoted in the lecture.
Okay, that's super interesting, guys.
Thank you. Yeah, time for one more question.
First of all, thank you so much. That has been great. So my question is related to the bomb as the object of desire, like as an object that has sort of like an agency / fatality to it, because I think like in the all the examples that you presented, Zanzotto's poem is pretty much like standing out like vis-a-vis the others, because in that case you do have an agent that was instrumental in essentially bombing happening. And so what I'm thinking about, that got me thinking, and I'm thinking of cases, Rosselli's poem, for example, the bomb falls. Nobody wonders like who is it on the plane, again having the being to blame for this. And so I was thinking of all the cases discussed nowadays, for example, the news where, for example, the use of passive voice when, again, there are killings where you can like specifically identify who is doing a military operation that is hurting someone else, but then like passive voice certainly like covers that responsibility. And so the question is, in all of these poems that you are analyzing, is it always the bomb that is kind of like fatal in falling without anyone being responsible for it? Or there are cases such as Zanzotto's where there is a political reason for that bomb falling? And if so, what are the consequences for that in your argument?
Thank you so much. Very complex question, very nuanced. As you mentioned, the text by Zanzotto stands out from the other 2, in which there is this impersonification with the perpetrator of this event. I would say that one of the other tendencies that I was not able to show is a sort of archaeological defeatism towards the atomic weapon. In some points, for example, by Elio Pagliarani, this beautiful collection titled Lezioni di Fisica, published in 1956, there is the identification between the poet and Heisenberg. So coming back towards a sort of archaeology of the atomic weapon and a share of responsibility between the poet voicing this anxiety and the origin, let's put it so, of this anxiety.
Again, thank you, Roberto. Of course, I'd like to invite you all to stay for perhaps a bit more conversation in the department for our usual reception. But first, please join me in thanking again Roberto and again with him.